Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my opinion on the best top laners for Season 5 patch 5.7, and quite possibly for patch 5.8 as well, depending on if there are any changes to top lane for patch 5.8. I took a look at the PBE and it doesn't look like there's going to be very many changes, so my list could quite possibly be the same for patch 5.8. If the title of the video says patch 5.8 when you're watching it, but on screen right now it says for patch 5.7, then that means there weren't many changes and therefore my list is still the same. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. First up on my list, I have Shyvana. So pros to Shyvana she's a very strong duelist, especially once you do pick up the Skirmisher Saver on her, and this is top lane Shyvana with Smite and Teleport that I am talking about right now. You can run Flash Teleport, but I think it's a lot weaker than running Smite Teleport because it just allows her to be a very strong laner if you do run the Smite Teleport. She's a very good split pusher as well because once you do pick up the Cinder Hulk on her, her W and the Cinder Hulk combined do a ton of AoE damage, which makes her split pushing really good. She's also super strong if you can get ahead with her because then she can go into the enemy's jungle and start stealing away their camps, which is really good, and it's going to put the enemy jungler behind quite a bit. She's also a very strong team fighter because of her ultimate. She can get to the back line really nicely with that, and she's got a great late game as well because of the Cinder Hulk item. She also has a very quick level 2 that you can do. What I like to do when I'm playing Shyvana is, depending on where my jungler is starting, I either take the Raptors or I take the Wolves to get a quick level 2 on my opponents in the top lane, because when you do run Smite as Shyvana, you're going to be able to take the Wolves or the Raptors really quickly, and then you can just teleport up to top lane and have the advantage on your opponent. Some cons to Shyvana are she doesn't have the strongest CC. Her ultimate provides a little bit, but her abilities or her normal abilities don't provide any CC, which is quite a big con in my opinion. And she also doesn't run Flash, obviously, because you're going to want to be running Smite and Teleport. Next up on my list, I have Irelia. So Irelia has stayed a pretty strong pick in my opinion for a very long time, and that's because she does have a very strong mid-game power spike, which not a lot of other champions in the game have. Once you do get to mid-game as her, once you do pick up the Trinity Force, she just does an insane amount of damage, and she can pretty much duel any champion in the game. She has true damage on her W as well, which is really nice, and she's got sustain in lane with her W as well. She has a gap closer on her Q, which is really good for catching your opponents off target. What you can do with your Q is you can dash to a low health minion, get the execute on it, and then dash to your opponent, and they won't expect it most of the time. She also has great level 6 burst because her ultimate paired with the Sheen does a ton of damage, and she's got a 2-second stun, which is really strong in my opinion for team fighting, especially because if you can get onto the enemy AD carry in a team fight and stun them, you're going to be able to burst them down most of the time before they can even get out of the stun. And she's also got pretty good wave clear as well because her ultimate is on a fairly short cooldown. Some cons to Irelia are she does have a weaker early game, so don't go aggressive in the early game as Irelia because most enemy top laners can end up winning the duel against you, especially for the first 3 levels I find when I'm playing her, and she can run out of mana in the early game if she is spamming her abilities. Next up on my list, I have Sion. So pros to Sion are he is a very strong lane bully. He's got great CC in lane, which makes it really easy to survive in lane and just poke down your opponents. He's a very strong roamer as well, especially when you do hit level 6 as him, because if I'm winning lane as Sion and I've pretty much got the if I've got the enemy's tower and I can't really do too much in the top lane anymore, then what I like to do is look for a lane gank down bot lane with my ultimate, because the chances of you picking up a kill with that lane gank is very high, so I would definitely recommend doing that when playing as Sion top lane. And he can also get the quick level 2 like Shyvana, because he can just take the Raptors or the Wolves depending on where your jungler is starting and get that nice level 2 advantage on your opponent. He's also pretty strong at setting up ganks for the jungler because of his strong CC, and he's also got a very low cooldown ultimate at max rank, so never be afraid to use your ultimate to engage or just get out of a bad situation once you do have that rank 3 on it, because it's on a very short cooldown. And some cons to Sion are he doesn't have any escapes pre-6, so you have to be careful that you're not pushing out in lane, and if you are pushing out in lane, then make sure that you do have the river warded. And he can also run out of mana quite quickly in the early game if you are spamming your abilities. Next up on my list, I have Hecarim. So pros to Hecarim are he's very versatile. He can either run TP Ignite or he can run Smite TP, depending on what your team needs. So if your team needs a tank, then I would definitely recommend running Smite Teleport and building the Cinder Hulk item. And if your team doesn't need any tanks, say you have a tanky jungler and a tanky support, then I would just recommend going TP Ignite so you can be more aggressive in the early game as Hecarim. He's a great roamer, especially once you do hit level 6 as him, because once you do get home guards on him, it makes his TP ganks really strong, and he's basically guaranteed to pick up a kill wherever he does gank with those TP home guards. And he's got a very strong mid game like Irelia because he does build Trinity Force. He's a bruiser as well, so Trinity Force is really the only item that I'll build for AD on him. Unless I'm really far ahead, then I might build Youmuu's Ghostblade, but I'll just most of the time build Trinity Force and then go full tank after that, and he still does a ton of damage. He's got great mobility as well with his E and his ultimate, and pretty strong sustain in lane with his W. He's got great pick potential because of his E and his ultimate, and he can also do the quick level 2 because he's got great AoE damage with his Q, which enables him to clear the raptors or the wolves out really quickly. Some cons to Hecarim are he doesn't have any escapes pre-6. His E is an okay escape, but if the enemy jungler does have some sort of CC, then it's going to be hard for you to get out, especially if it's going to be hard for you to get out because you are not going to be running flash on Hecarim, and he also can run out of mana in the early game. So on all these champions that can run out of mana in the early game, I would definitely recommend building a Crystalline Flask on Hecarim, Irelia, and Sion. So last but not least, on my top 5, I have Vladimir. Pros to Vladimir are he's got great sustain in lane with his Q, and once you do pick up the Will of the Ancients on him, or I guess once you do pick up the Hextech Revolver on him, he can sustain even better, which is really good for just staying in lane and farming up. He is a very strong laner because of that sustain and because of his poke damage. And he's very safe with his W in lane as well because he can just easily avoid ganks, especially if his flash and his W are up. It's going to be very hard for the enemies to secure a kill on him. He's also got great AoE damage with his E and his ultimate, and sustained damage as well, which is why I've got him rated so high on my list, because in this tank meta right now, it's really important to have sustained damage and not as much burst damage, because when you do have sustained damage, you're going to be able to constantly deal damage to those tanks and chunk them down, where if you have burst damage, the chances of you bursting down a tank are very low unless you're extremely fed, so having a sustained damage champion in this meta is really strong. He's also a monster if you can get to late game as him because of his strong AoE damage, and his ultimate just does a ton of damage come late game. And one big pro to him is that if you do get fed as him, he has 2v1 potential because of his strong AoE damage and his W. A con to Vladimir is that if you do shove out in lane with him, then he is a pretty easy gank target. So if you are shoving out in lane, then I would definitely recommend that you do put some wards in the river, or just don't shove out in lane as him. I know it's hard to not shove if you're using your E, because if you're going for poke on the enemy and you use your E to poke them down, then it's going to automatically shove out the lane. But if you do end up shoving into the enemy's tower, then like I said, you're going to be a fairly easy gank target. So if you can stay in the middle of the lane, then it's really hard to gank him. But because of Vladimir's AoE damage, you do end up shoving the lane most of the time, and then therefore I would just recommend buying a ward so you do not die in the early game. So first up on the honorable mentions, I have Maokai. Maokai is definitely one of my strongest go-to champions in the top lane. He's a very strong laner, he's got great team fights, and he's just very consistent in my opinion. So if you're looking for a consistent top laner with strong CC and pretty good team fight, then I would definitely recommend trying out Maokai. Next up I have Rumble. So in my opinion, I wouldn't recommend jumping straight into ranked with Rumble because his ultimate is a harder ability to land, and I know I say this in pretty much every video, but I definitely would recommend trying him out in some normal games, because if you can't land your ultimate, then you're missing out on a lot of his damage and a lot of his pick potential. However, if you can land his ultimate, then he is a very rewarding champion, and he's also a very strong laner as well. Next up, I have Nasus. So Nasus is pretty good in this meta right now because a lot of the top laners aren't the most aggressive early game top laners, so it makes it pretty easy for him to farm up with his Q. Some harder matchups for him right now, I would say, are Vladimir and Sion, but other than that, he does pretty well in this meta right now, so I would definitely recommend trying out Nasus as long as the enemy doesn't lock in a Vladimir or a Sion. Next up I have Riven. So Riven does have some weaker lane matchups, but if you can get ahead with her, then she snowballs really hard and she can do a ton of damage once you do get your core items on Riven. So she is more of a skilled pick and she does require having a stronger early game, but if you're feeling a little bit risky or you do know how to play Riven correctly, then she's definitely a very rewarding pick. Next up I have Cho'Gath. So I rated Cho'Gath pretty high for mid lane, but I do think he is a pretty strong top laner as well, because he's got great sustain in lane, pretty much everything that mid lane Cho'Gath has. He's got great poke, he's got great level 6 all-in burst. So if you're looking for a fairly solid top laner with great sustain in lane and a very strong team fighter as well in my opinion, then I would definitely recommend picking up Cho'Gath. And last but not least, on my honorable mentions, I have Malphite. So Malphite has also been one of the most consistent top laners for me. I just like to start Crystalline Flask when I play him to sustain the early game, and then once I do pick up the Sheen or the Iceborne Gauntlet on him, then he does a surprising amount of damage, and I always like to go for the level 6 all-in once I have those items on him, because you're going to be able to surprise your opponents with your burst damage. He's also a very strong teamfight champion as well because of his ultimate, giving him really good pick potential. So as long as you can survive the early game as Malphite, then he becomes a very strong pick in the mid to late game. So that is all for the video, guys. If you enjoyed, then be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you all have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.